Let's pick up on a story we touched on a little earlier this hour. It has been nearly 2 months since over 70 people died in the fire that engulfed a hijacked building in Marshalltown in Johannesburg. The people who survived that fire were relocated, but some of them now saying today that they're about to be made homeless again. I'm joined now by Muano Nemavhidi of SERI, which is the Social Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. She joins me in studio. Thank you so much for coming through. Our reporter Bafedile has been on the story all day, and what Bafedile has found is that these people are not living in great conditions at all. They're living in a communal hall, mattresses on the floor, there's just one toilet block for people, and we're talking nearly 2 months since this horrific accident. So what obligation is there for the city or other government structures regarding looking after people in a situation like this? What is the government's obligation?
I think, firstly, I should thank you for having me, but primarily with regard to what the city of Johannesburg is required to do is basically to ensure that human rights are observed to the fullest. The spirit and the object and the purports of the Bill of Rights must be adhered to. These include ensuring that people have accommodation that accords with dignity, especially in an emergency situation. Government is expected to be responsive, not reactive per se. They need to plan proactively. So the policies are already there. We have the Emergency Housing Code and the likes of them that set out the steps government should take in the event of a situation like this one. But it seems that in the present circumstances, we've had a haphazard, poorly coordinated response that has led to the situation we now see. I can scarcely imagine a world in which it accords with dignity to have people in one big hall, male and female, children as well, sharing a single portaloo. I sympathize with the residents that have gone from one emergency to another, seemingly from the pot to the frying pan, it seems.
Yeah, and I want you to actually listen to one of the people, one of the social workers on site who's trying to help, what he had to say a little earlier. Just take a listen.
There was a plan to say, you know, this is the plan. On this particular day, people will be moved out to some place. We as activists, volunteers, NGOs could also plan. You know, we could also plan. I mean, in this facility right now, there's only one set of toilet and showers for 50 days. If after the first 5 days, disaster management came back to us and said, no, listen, you're going to be there at least for 50 days. We could have reached out to donors and said, can you provide some mobile toilets and showers? 105 men, 36 women, 28 children sharing that facility. It's a recreation hall. It's for recreation, not for disaster management. So this is what we're still calling upon, you know, government, various spheres of government, whether it be housing, human settlements. We've even written to President Ramaphosa and Cochter to say, can you share the plan with us? Because we cannot see a plan. We don't want a theoretical plan. We want a plan which ties into what we are actually seeing on the ground. People want to run their business again. So some sort of grant to get people to work and start their own businesses. We've seen, we've given some people some funding to start their small business, and we've seen that they bought the next round of stock with the profits that they've made. People don't want to stay here. People don't want to stay in the street either.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're talking about 70 people in this particular shelter who don't have a home. And exactly what he was saying is that if there was a plan, why is there no plan? Whose sole duty is it to have a clear plan that's communicated to everyone that can perhaps bring the NGOs on board to help? Why is there no plan?
I don't think it's as much of a situation in which we don't have an on-paper plan for the response we should have to this situation. I'd intimated earlier that there's such a thing as the Emergency Housing Code. Under the code, it delineates the steps that a local government authority should take in an emergency such as a fire that we've seen now. So the only difficulty is they're failing to apply what the theory says and bringing it into living color for the people that need it the most. In such circumstances, they were obliged to have budgeted appropriately, or where budgets from their own funds do not suffice for the purpose, they seek a grant from the provincial level.
So it's one of two things, surely. They don't know how to do it, or they simply don't care. What do you think it is?
It could be both. At this point, it's not quite certain what the problem is, but what we've been observing is a lack of proper engagement with the residents on the ground, meaning that even if they were trying to do something, there is a paucity of data on which to do it. So it would have a haphazard response, and we're not talking simply about individuals that can afford to just go and live somewhere else. These are individuals that are at the mercy of the state. So when the state falters, we have a situation like this where people are living in inhumane conditions. Not to say that where they were was any better, but to take the situation and make it much worse seems to me a much greater evil.
How long does the duty of the state exist towards these people? Because bear in mind they were renting rooms illegally, it has to be said. How long does the duty of care continue for the state according to the documents you mentioned and the rules that you mentioned? And what are they duty bound to provide in terms of a level of facilities?
I think one, I would deflect from trying to analyze the nature of their occupation. What we do understand is that these are individuals that are indigent and cannot in the ordinary course, informal housing, provide for themselves a place to stay. So for as long as that situation where they're exposed to the threat of homelessness persists, the government is obliged, in particular local government, to plan proactively to ensure that there's social housing that caters for all brackets of the income segments that it can cover. And in situations like this where it's now an emergency, they were obliged to have planned for shelters that would accommodate them. So that is their responsibility for as long as the threat of homelessness persists.
Sure, but doesn't that apply to so many hundreds of thousands of South Africans who are living in informal settlements? Isn't there a responsibility on the part of government to help them? And government just simply, I mean, with the best will in the world, doesn't have the money or the capacity.
I wouldn't suggest that it's necessarily a case of not having the capacity, but that what capacity we do have is not utilized effectively. You can have the best resources, the best personnel, but if you don't allocate it accordingly, you will still fail. I'll just bring to mind a particular example that at Seri we've encountered. We have a case in Ekurhuleni where there were houses that were allocated approximately 18 to 20 years ago, and the people have still not received them. Budgets have been released every financial year, but still no housing has been allocated. So with the space of a few decades and still having failed to allocate houses that were just short of having the keys handed over to their proper owners, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a case of scarce resources or a lack of will. It might be incapacity or perhaps maybe malice. Who would know?
So, speaking of malice, when the fire happened in Marshalltown, your organisation in particular was singled out as a problem, trying to, you know, that you were getting in the way of government's attempts to evict people from hijacked buildings. And your response at the time, if I recall, was that you were simply upholding the law. It's all there in the law, how government's meant to behave. And you're basically saying, government, you need to do your job. There was a lot of talk at the time of let's challenge the PI Act, which is the Prevention of Illegal Evictions, that this is just absolutely not right. Has there been any movement on that? You know, we saw so many politicians using it as a backdrop to say how bad things are and we need to clear up the inner city and NGOs are getting in the way. Have they done anything since those big public statements?
I don't think so, at least not in the way that things should be done. I think when people try to treat a symptom of an illness, which is a lack of affordable housing, by trying to remove people, they forget that it becomes an ongoing cycle. If I remove person X from the only shelter they've known, they're going to go into the streets, and where the next available opportunity to reside somewhere avails itself, they will do so. And then we'll have a self-perpetuating cycle. So effectively, what was supposed to have taken place from the moment that they realized that there was a crisis is to amplify efforts to ensure that every single person that can be accommodated by our social housing legislation can be accommodated in order to avoid a situation where you have random raids to remove people, as has been the case since the fire.
And has Seri had any follow-up action? You know, have any of these politicians come to you and said, listen, we need to work together better, or we need to change the laws and you need to know about it? Has anything changed?
No, I wouldn't say so. As Seri, what we have done is we had, during the debate on the amendments to the PI Act, we had submitted our suggestions as to what could improve the situation. Of course, the outcomes of that are yet to be seen. On another level, we had written to the city in order to obtain an update as to what they had been doing pertaining to a previous correspondence, which had effectively said, engage with us. People are on the ground and they're willing to assist those that have been displaced and require some level of assistance, and that conditions are not appropriate in the buildings. But again, we were left in the lurch with no response.
All right. Thank you so much for coming to studio and telling us your side of the story and what you have been trying to do in the intervening time. That, of course, is Muano Nemavhidi of SERI. That's the Social Economic Rights Institute of South Africa.